Case 1. Susan Smith. Late on the night of October 25, 1994, a young mother in Union, South Carolina walked her car to the edge of John D. Long Lake, put it in gear, and let it roll into the water with her two sons still buckled into their car seats. Susan Smith was 23 years old. Within the hour, she was telling police a completely different story, that a black man in a knit cap had carjacked her at a stoplight and driven off with her boys inside. For 9 days, she went in front of cameras and begged for their safe return, while search teams combed the county. What nobody watching those broadcasts knew yet was that Susan already knew exactly where her sons were. To understand how she got to that lake, you have to go back further. Susan lost her father to suicide when she was 6. As a teenager, she disclosed sexual abuse by her stepfather and tried to take her own life at 13. She married David Smith in 1991, and the marriage came apart under the weight of affairs on both sides. Susan had started seeing a wealthy local man named Tom Findley, and she believed he might be her way out of a marriage that was already falling apart. Then Findley ended things, and he was specific about why. He told her plainly that raising another man's children wasn't something he wanted. For Susan, that rejection landed like a verdict. On the night of the 25th, she drove to the lake with 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex strapped into the back seat. She stepped out, released the parking brake, and watched the car roll roughly 120 feet into the water before it disappeared. Then she walked to a nearby house and told the family inside that a stranger had just stolen her car with her children in it. Her television appeals made her a sympathetic figure across the country. But her account of the carjacking had holes in it from the start. Details about a traffic light sequence that didn't line up with how the intersection actually worked. Timelines that shifted every time she repeated them. She failed polygraph after polygraph. On November 3rd, after more than a week of pressure from investigators, Susan finally admitted the truth. Divers pulled the car from the lake with both boys still inside, exactly where she'd left them. At her 1995 trial, her defense didn't try to claim she hadn't done it. Instead, they argued about why. Her attorney told the jury this was a case built on despair rather than malice, and mental health experts described a woman with deeply dependent personality traits shaped by years of trauma. Prosecutors pushed back hard, arguing this was a calculated choice, a woman who decided her children were an obstacle standing between her and the relationship she wanted. After deliberating for 2.5 hours, the jury spared her the death penalty and instead sentenced her to life, with parole eligibility after 30 years. Susan has been housed at Leith Correctional Institution since 2000. In November 2024, she came up for parole for the first time. Her ex-husband David showed up to oppose her release, telling the board flatly that what she did was a choice, not an accident. Susan told the board she understood the weight of what she'd done and said she believed she'd found forgiveness on a spiritual level. The board said no. She'll be eligible to try again in 2026, and behind bars, her record includes both disciplinary write-ups and participation in prison programs. Before we continue, hit subscribe here at Daily Crime Archive, because by the end of this list, you'll want to know exactly how each of these cases finally cracked open. Case 2. Darlie Routier. June 6, 1996, Rowlett, Texas. Darlie Routier called 911 to report that a stranger had broken into her home, attacked her 2 young sons, and cut her as she fought back before running off into the night. Her husband Darren and their infant son Drake had been asleep upstairs the entire time. Darlie was 26. Investigators arrived expecting to hunt for an intruder. What they found instead didn't add up. There should have been footprints in the garage if someone had come through there. There weren't any. A layer of dust on the windowsill hadn't been touched. Blood spatter analysis on Darlie's nightshirt pointed toward a level of proximity that was hard to reconcile with her account of a struggle against a stranger. 75 yards from the house, police found a sock with blood on it, a detail that didn't fit cleanly into the timeline she'd given, and the screen that was supposedly cut to let an intruder in. Forensic examiners determined the cuts had been made from inside the garage, not outside it. Investigators zeroed in on a financial angle too. Darlie and Darren had taken out $10,000 life insurance policies on each boy. The defense argued that amount was far too small to be a real motive, and pointed to an unidentified fingerprint recovered at the scene as proof someone else had been there. None of it stopped Darlie's arrest on June 18, 1996. Detectives had concluded the evidence contradicted her story at nearly every turn, and that the scene had been arranged to look like a break-in that never happened. Her 1997 trial turned partly on video that had nothing to do with the night of the killings. Home video from a memorial gathering at the boys' graves showed Darlie laughing and playing during what prosecutors called a wildly inappropriate celebration for a grieving mother. Her demeanor on the stand didn't help her case either. To supporters, the footage was Darlie trying to mark her son's birthday in her own way. To the jury, it read as something else entirely. On February 4, 1997, they convicted her, and she was sent to death row. Darlie remains at the Patrick O'Daniel unit in Gatesville, and she has never wavered from her claim of innocence. Her former husband, Darren, has publicly backed her account for years. Her legal team has pushed for renewed DNA testing on the fingerprint and other physical evidence. And as of 2025, those requests are still working through the courts. In a 2006 interview, she tried to explain the graveside video, insisting she'd only been trying to honor her son in her own way. Her advocates keep pointing to that unidentified print and the out-of-place sock as reasons the case deserves another look. Case 3. Julie Schenecker, January 27, 2011. Tampa, Florida. A welfare check at the Schenecker home turned into a homicide scene. 50-year-old Julie Schenecker, the wife of an Army officer, was found unresponsive inside the house, and her 2 teenagers were dead. She had bought the gun used just days before. By her own later account, Julie had reached a breaking point with her kids' behavior, describing them as impossible to manage. That January afternoon, she shot her son first, as he sat in the car after coming home from soccer practice. Then she went inside and shot her daughter in her bedroom. She covered both of their bodies with blankets afterward, and detectives later recovered a note she'd left behind, one whose contents made clear just how far gone her thinking had become. It was Julie's own mother who asked police to check on the family after being unable to reach them, and this wasn't the household's first brush with authorities. There had been an earlier report raising concerns. When officers arrived and found Julie, they took her into custody on the spot. She admitted to what she'd done, but told them she couldn't explain why she'd done it. And that confusion would end up sitting at the center of her entire trial. Her defense leaned heavily into her psychiatric history. She'd been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and relatives testified about watching her mental state unravel in the months before the shootings. Witnesses described a woman on multiple medications who seemed to be slipping further from reality by the week. Prosecutors countered that none of that erased what she'd done deliberately. She'd bought a weapon, she'd written a note in advance, and those weren't the actions of someone acting on impulse. In May 2014, jurors took less than 2 hours to convict her. She received life without parole. Her ex-husband Parker said the verdict brought him relief. Julie remains incarcerated in Florida as of 2025, with a recent appeal already turned down. In conversations from behind bars, she has expressed remorse, and she continues to receive mental health treatment while serving her sentence. If these cases are hitting you hard, that's the point. Daily Crime Archive exists to walk through exactly how investigators untangled stories like these, one piece of evidence at a time. Case 4. Amber Pasternak. September 2016, Indiana. 29-year-old Amber Pasternak drove herself to a police station and turned herself in. Inside her car were her 2 children, both already dead by suffocation. On her way there, she had also attacked a 66-year-old neighbor, Frank McComber. a man who had previously helped her get around during a custody dispute. Amber's history was one of long-running instability. She'd been diagnosed with bipolar disorder at 16, and her file with social services stretched back to 2011, full of welfare concerns and stretches where caseworkers simply couldn't locate her. On top of the bipolar diagnosis, she was dealing with paranoid delusions and using drugs to try to manage her symptoms herself. A string of unstable relationships and constantly shifting living situations only made things worse over time. In September 2016, in the middle of a custody battle, Amber took her kids, later telling investigators she believed she was protecting them from dangers that, as it turned out, existed only in her mind. After killing them, she drove roughly to Fort Wayne with their bodies still in the car and turned herself in. A drive investigators believe took hours, during which she appeared to grapple with what she'd just done. Before any of that, she had attacked Frank McComber, and evidence suggested she'd been planning her actions for a while beforehand. In jailhouse statements, she insisted she'd been trying to save her children, a claim that only underscored how detached from reality her thinking had become. Even so, psychiatric evaluators determined she understood what she was doing and was competent to stand trial. Her illness was real, but it hadn't erased her grasp of right and wrong. In June 2017, Amber pleaded guilty while citing her mental illness. For the deaths of her children, she was sentenced to 130 years. A year later, in 2018, she received an additional 65 years for killing Frank McComber, bringing her total to 195 years. She remains in an Indiana prison as of 2025, with no chance of ever getting out. In court, she said she was sorry, words that offered little comfort to the families left behind, and she continues to receive mental health treatment while incarcerated. Case 5. Debra Jeter. May 5, 2009, Texas. Debra Jeter picked up her 2 daughters for a scheduled visitation. Nothing unusual on paper. Instead of taking them where she was supposed to, the 31-year-old drove to an empty, abandoned house and attacked both girls with a knife. One daughter died from her wounds. The other survived despite injuries that were, by any measure, critical. Debra's marriage to Lee Jeter had recently collapsed, and those close to her described a woman who wasn't coping. Weeks before the attack, she had attempted suicide in front of her own daughters. She carried an undiagnosed or at least untreated diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, and by the spring of 2009 she seemed to have run out of any sense that things could get better, for herself or for her girls. On the day of the visitation, everything looked routine until she diverted from the plan and drove to the vacant property instead. In her own later words, she described wanting to take away all their pain. She attacked both girls, then called 911 herself and told the dispatcher, almost matter-of-factly, that she had just killed her children. On that same call, she could be heard telling one of her daughters to hold on, a strange, contradictory moment of care in the middle of what she'd just done. Paramedics arrived to find both girls with severe wounds to the throat. The knife was later found sitting on top of Debra's car. The younger girl didn't survive. The older one, despite catastrophic injuries, was still conscious and able to give police information at the scene before being rushed into emergency surgery. Doctors worked for hours to stabilize her, and her survival was later called remarkable given how badly she'd been hurt. Debra was taken into custody at the scene and placed under close watch given obvious concerns about her state of mind. She said very little afterward beyond what she'd already told the 911 dispatcher. Her attorney later spoke publicly about her remorse and her mental health struggles, trying to give some context to what had happened. In June 2010, to spare her surviving daughter from having to testify, Debra pleaded guilty. She received life without parole. The sheriff who worked the case called it one of the hardest he'd ever been part of. Debra remains in a Texas prison as of 2025. Her surviving daughter has physically recovered and lives with her father, though the emotional scars from that day are permanent. Case 6. Monica Sementilli. January 2017, Woodland Hills, California. Fabio Sementilli, a well-known Los Angeles hairstylist, was found dead on the patio of his own home, killed in a brutal knife attack. At first, it looked random. It wasn't. Investigators eventually traced the killing back to a plan built by his wife of 25 years, Monica Sementilli, and the man she was having an affair with. Monica was 48 at the time, and she'd been involved for a while with her personal trainer, Robert Baker. The two had grown close enough to start imagining a future together, one that didn't include Fabio. Prosecutors said Monica's motive wasn't just romantic. There was a $1.6 million life insurance policy on Fabio, and rather than go through a divorce that would have split their assets, she chose something far more permanent. On the night Fabio was killed, Monica reportedly left a door at the house unlocked. Robert Baker came in and attacked Fabio out on the back patio, while Monica was allegedly elsewhere inside. The attack was savage. Fabio was struck more than 30 times. Baker then fled in Fabio's Porsche, which police later recovered. Both Monica and Baker were arrested not long after the killing in 2017. During the investigation, a third man came forward and told police that Baker had approached him earlier, trying to recruit him into the plan, an offer he'd turned down. That testimony became a key piece in establishing that the killing had been planned well in advance, and that Monica had known about it. Phone records and surveillance video backed up the timeline prosecutors laid out. Even after his own conviction, Baker publicly insisted Monica had nothing to do with it and that he'd acted alone. Prosecutors argued otherwise, and ultimately convinced a jury that Monica had been running the whole operation from the start. Monica's trial took place in April 2025, and she was convicted of conspiracy along with other charges. In June 2025, she was sentenced to life without parole. Fabio's sister spoke at sentencing about the depth of the betrayal the family felt. Monica is now incarcerated in California. Robert Baker had already received a life without parole sentence of his own for carrying out the killing. Neither of them will ever be free again. If you're finding these deep dives into how these cases actually broke open worth your time, that subscribe button and the notification bell are right there. More of these are coming from Daily Crime Archive every week. Case 7. Lori Vallow Daybell. September 2019, Idaho. 2 children vanished from their family's home, setting off a nationwide search that eventually pulled back the curtain on one of the strangest and most disturbing cases in recent memory. Their mother, Lori Vallow Daybell, had spent years drifting deeper into fringe religious beliefs, and at the center of the conspiracy that unfolded were not just her children, but several other people connected to her life, nearly all of whom would end up dead. Lori came from a religious upbringing that gradually curdled into something far more extreme, a belief system built around end times prophecy and a hierarchy that ranked people by their spiritual light. She met author Chad Daybell, who shared similar views, and together the two built a worldview where certain people could be labeled as dark spirits or obstacles standing in the way of their mission. According to prosecutors, Lori began applying those labels to people close to her, including, eventually, her own children. Money mattered too. Insurance payouts and survivor benefits stood to bring in significant funds. The children were last seen in September 2019, and Lori didn't report them missing. When family and authorities started asking pointed questions, she gave shifting answers, claiming at different points that the kids were staying with friends or relatives. In truth, they had already been killed, and their bodies were later found buried on Chad Daybell's Idaho property. One child had been suffocated. The other's injuries were more extensive. The discovery devastated investigators and the community following the case. As detectives dug deeper, they found a disturbing pattern surrounding the couple. Chad's previous wife had died suddenly just weeks before he married Lori, a death that later prompted authorities to exhume her body. Lori's own former husband had died as well, in what was initially treated as self-defense involving Lori's brother, who himself died shortly after that. Taken together, the string of deaths around the couple raised serious red flags. Phone data and surveillance footage helped investigators map out where everyone had been and when. When the children's remains were finally recovered in June 2020, both Lori and Chad were arrested, and forensic evidence from the burial site filled in crucial details about what had happened to the kids. During her 2023 Idaho trial, prosecutors laid out extensive evidence of the couple's beliefs and the disturbing things Lori had reportedly said about her own children. Witnesses described the ideology in detail. The jury convicted her, and she received multiple life sentences without parole. Even after conviction, Lori kept insisting she'd done nothing wrong, framing everything through a spiritual lens. Separate proceedings in Arizona dealt with other incidents tied to her former husband's death and an attempted killing of another person. In April 2025, she was convicted of conspiracy in those cases, and in July 2025, she received additional consecutive life sentences on top of what she already had. Before her Arizona sentencing, Lori spoke in court about finding her children, while still denying responsibility for their deaths. She's now held at the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Idaho, where she'll remain for the rest of her life. Appeals have been filed, though legal analysts give them little chance given how much evidence prosecutors presented at trial. Case 8. Kara Alexander, November 15, 2022, London. A father came home to find a scene no parent should ever walk into. His wife, 47-year-old Kara Alexander, had drowned their 2 young sons in the bathtub. What made the case so unsettling was how completely it seemed to come out of nowhere from a mother everyone described as loving. People who knew Kara consistently described her as warm and devoted to her boys, with no history of anything that would have raised alarm. But in the weeks leading up to that November night, she had been heavily and repeatedly using a powerful substance known to trigger serious psychological reactions in some users. Medical experts later concluded that her ongoing use of it had brought on a full psychotic episode on the night of the killings. Kara was alone with her sons when she lost touch with reality entirely. She filled the tub and held both boys under the water until they stopped breathing. When their father got home, he found them and immediately called emergency services, but it was already too late. Both boys had drowned, confirmed later by autopsy. Psychiatric evaluation determined Kara had genuinely been in a substance-induced psychotic state at the time, the kind that can strip away a person's grip on reality entirely. Experts testified she likely had no real awareness of what she was doing or its consequences while it was happening. The episode had temporarily erased her normal instincts and judgment as a parent. Legal proceedings still had to wrestle with how much responsibility that left her holding. Her actions during the psychosis weren't calculated in any ordinary sense, but the court weighed the fact that it was her own choice to keep using the substance that triggered it. In February 2025, a jury convicted her. At sentencing that April, the judge called the case something out of a nightmare, acknowledging both its horror and its unusual circumstances. Kara received a life sentence with a minimum of 21 years before any possibility of release. The boy's father gave a statement describing grief he said he still couldn't fully put into words. Kara remains in a UK prison as of 2025. Case 9. Shiloh, Chigwada, February 2024, Hemel Hempstead, England. Emergency services took a disturbing call from 30-year-old Shiloh Chigwada, a Zimbabwean nurse working in the UK. She'd just killed her young daughter. Police arrived to find the child had been suffocated. What came out afterward pointed to something colder than a mental health crisis alone. A custody battle turned into an act meant to wound her ex-partner in the worst way imaginable. Shiloh had built a career as a nurse in Britain, but her home life had been unraveling. She'd recently lost custody of her daughter through the courts, a blow that hit her hard. According to investigators and later testimony, she'd been consumed by anger toward her ex and by depression over losing her daughter. Instead of seeking help for what she was feeling, she began turning her anger into a plan to hurt him in the most devastating way she could imagine. On that February day, while alone with her daughter, Shiloh acted on that plan. suffocating the child with a bag. Afterward, she called emergency services herself, claiming during the call that she'd been suffering a mental health crisis. An attempt, prosecutors would later argue, to build a defense before the investigation had even started. But the evidence didn't back up her claim of a total break with reality. Prosecutors laid out testimony pointing to revenge as her real motive, not confusion. The custody loss had happened well before the killing, and people close to her described a woman growing more bitter and angrier by the week. Her messages and behavior in the run-up to the killing pointed to planning, rather than a sudden loss of control. Evaluators did find she was genuinely depressed, but concluded that depression hadn't taken away her ability to understand what she was doing, or that it was wrong. In April 2025, a jury convicted her. At sentencing, the court heard from grieving family members, including the child's father, who spoke about the enormity of what he'd lost. The judge handed down a life sentence with a minimum of 16 years, noting that while mental health factors were part of the picture, the underlying motive of revenge was unmistakable. Shiloh remains in custody in the UK as of 2025.
Leticia Stauch. On January 27, 2020, a young boy disappeared from his Colorado home. His stepmother, Leticia Stauch, reported that he had left to visit a friend and never returned. The search for him would captivate the nation, but the truth was far more sinister than anyone initially imagined. What had really happened to the missing boy? Leticia had married the boy's father and become his stepmother, but the relationship between them had reportedly been strained. Testimony and evidence would later suggest she harbored feelings of resentment toward the child. On that January day, while his father was away, Leticia attacked the boy in their home using multiple methods, including a blade, blunt force, and eventually a weapon. The brutality of the attack suggested intense anger and a determination to ensure he would not survive. After taking his life, Leticia placed his body in a suitcase. She then began an elaborate cover-up, reporting him missing and participating in searches while knowing exactly what had happened. She transported his remains across state lines to Florida, where she disposed of the suitcase. The suitcase was eventually discovered weeks later, providing investigators with the evidence they needed to piece together what had occurred. How did investigators uncover her deception? From the beginning, investigators found inconsistencies in Leticia's account of events. Her story changed multiple times as she attempted to explain what had happened. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's camera showed Leticia leaving the house with the boy, but returning alone, with what appeared to be different items in her vehicle. Phone records and digital forensics placed her in locations that contradicted her statements. During interviews with detectives, Leticia provided various explanations, at one point claiming the incident had been accidental. She even conducted a video call with the detective, questioning him about male officers who had been at her home. Her behavior throughout the investigation raised additional suspicions. Leticia was arrested in March 2020 in South Carolina. During her 2023 trial, she claimed to suffer from dissociative identity disorder and blamed an alternate personality for the actions. Psychological experts testified that she did not actually have this condition and that she was feigning symptoms. They found she had personality traits, including borderline and narcissistic characteristics, but she was legally sane and understood her actions. What was the outcome of her trial? The jury found Leticia guilty of first-degree proceedings in May 2023. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of release, plus an additional 156 years for other charges. The judge described the case as one of the most disturbing to come through the court. The boy's biological mother and father both provided victim impact statements, describing their devastation and the permanent hole left in their lives. Leticia showed little emotion during the sentencing. Even while incarcerated, recordings of her phone calls revealed her discussing plans to escape and her continued denial of responsibility. Pam Hupp. In December 2011, a woman was found deceased in her home in Troy, Missouri. Her husband was initially convicted of taking her life, but the case would eventually lead investigators to Pam Hupp, a woman whose name would become connected to multiple suspicious incidents. 2011 was just the beginning of a pattern that would span years. What series of events revealed her involvement? Pam had been born in 1958 and lived what appeared to be a suburban existence. She had worked in insurance and other positions, though there were reports of issues including document falsification that led to job terminations. In 2011, her friend was found with 55 stab wounds in a case initially attributed to the victim's husband. Pam had been the last person known to see her friend alive, and she had been named as a beneficiary on a life insurance policy worth a significant sum. 2 years later, in 2013, Pam's own mother experienced a fatal fall from a balcony. While officially ruled as undetermined, the circumstances raised questions, particularly given that Pam stood to benefit from her mother's estate. Investigators noted suspicious elements but did not file charges at that time. The most definitive case came in 2016 when Pam shot a man named Louis Gumpenberger in her home. She claimed self-defense, stating he had broken in and attacked her. However, investigators discovered that Pam had approached Louis, who had mental and physical difficulties, and offered him money to participate in what she described as a project. She had then staged a scene with planted items, including a note and a weapon, to make it appear he had intended to harm her. How did authorities finally connect all these incidents? The 2016 case proved to be Pam's undoing, as investigators quickly determined the scene had been fabricated. Evidence suggested she had been attempting to frame the husband who had been convicted in the 2011 case, trying to make it appear he had hired someone to harm Pam in retaliation. Her statements to police after the shooting contained numerous contradictions. Rather than face trial where evidence about all the suspicious incidents would be presented, Pam entered an offered plea in 2019. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of release for the 2016 case. The conviction in the 2016 case prompted authorities to re-examine the 2011 incident. The husband who had been convicted was eventually exonerated after spending years in prison for something he did not do. In 2021, prosecutors refiled charges against Pam for that original incident. Her trial for the 2011 case is scheduled for August 2026, and prosecutors are seeking the maximum penalty. Pam is currently held at Shiloh Correctional Center in Missouri. In 2025, legal proceedings determined that her prison wages would be garnished to provide restitution to the victim's mother. During depositions related to civil cases, she has repeatedly refused to answer questions.
Case 10, Kelly Lane. September 1996, Sydney. Kelly Lane gave birth to a baby girl in a hospital and checked out 2 days later with the infant in her arms. That baby was never seen again, and the world wouldn't even know to ask questions about her for more than a decade. Kelly had grown up the daughter of a hospital worker and a police officer, and she went on to become an elite water polo player who competed at a high level for years. What almost no one around her knew was that she had concealed several pregnancies during that entire athletic career, quietly giving birth to children that her friends, family, and teammates never had any idea existed. Some of those babies were placed for adoption through proper channels. Others simply vanished from any official record. The case began to unravel in 2003, when investigators noticed gaps and inconsistencies while cross-checking adoption paperwork against birth records. That's how they found the 1996 birth, a baby with no documented outcome. Keeley claims she'd handed the infant over to the biological father, a man she named as Andrew Morris, or possibly Andrew Norris. Investigators searched exhaustively and could never find anyone matching that description. No records, no witnesses, nothing that confirmed this man had ever existed. Psychological assessments found nothing that pointed to any diagnosable disorder driving her actions. Instead, experts described someone making calculated, self-protective decisions, aimed at preserving her carefully built public image as a rising athlete. Each pregnancy she hid required real planning and deception to pull off. Because no remains were ever recovered, the entire case against Keeley rested on circumstantial evidence. Prosecutors argued she had killed her daughter shortly after leaving the hospital. Keeley maintained to the end that she'd handed the baby to the father. Phone records showed she'd called her mother the day she left the hospital and reportedly told her she'd had no choice about what she needed to do. In 2010, after a long trial, Keeley was convicted and sentenced to 18 years. She has never stopped insisting she's innocent and continues to claim her daughter is alive somewhere. In March 2024, she was denied parole under a law that blocks consideration for people convicted in no-body cases unless they disclose where the remains are. During her time in custody, she alleged mistreatment by a corrections officer, leading to legal action and testimony she later gave before Parliament. Keeley remains held at Silverwater Women's Correctional Center, still denying any wrongdoing. That's 10 cases. 10 completely different paths to the same devastating outcome. And in every one of them, it was patient, methodical investigative work that finally separated what these women claimed happened from what the evidence actually showed. If you want more cases broken down exactly like this, subscribe to Daily Crime Archive and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.